Imagine standing at the northern edge of the Roman Empire almost 2,000 years ago. Behind you lies the most powerful civilization the world has ever seen. Rome has conquered mighty kingdoms, crossed deserts, bridged vast rivers, and marched its legions from the Atlantic Ocean to the Middle East. Its soldiers have defeated countless enemies, and its engineers have built roads that seem to stretch to the ends of the earth. Victory has become so familiar that many Romans believe there is no land beyond their reach. But today, everything feels different. The air is colder. Thick mist rolls across the hills, swallowing the landscape until even the nearest trees disappear from view. The roads that carried Rome this far begin to fade into rough tracks, then into little more than mud and stone. The local guides grow quieter with every mile. Veterans who have fought across Europe speak in hushed voices of a people unlike any they have encountered before. They tell stories of warriors who appear from the forests without warning, strike with terrifying speed, and vanish into the mountains before a counterattack can even begin. Then, somewhere beyond the fog, a horn echoes across the valley. Moments later, dark figures emerge from the mist. They carry long spears and beautifully decorated shields, unlike anything seen elsewhere in Britain. Some appear to have strange markings on their skin. Others wear finely crafted brooches that catch the weak northern sunlight. They do not advance like Roman soldiers, marching in perfect formation. They move with the landscape itself, slipping between rocks, disappearing behind ridges, and reappearing where they are least expected. For perhaps the first time in his military career, a Roman soldier realizes something unsettling. These people have no intention of surrendering. Centuries later, Rome would remember them by a single name, the Picti, the Painted People. It is a name that has survived for almost 2,000 years. Yet almost everything else about them remains wrapped in mystery. They built powerful kingdoms but left almost no written history of their own. They carved hundreds of remarkable stones covered with symbols that scholars still cannot fully explain. They stood against Rome, survived centuries of warfare, and helped shape the future of Scotland. Then, almost as suddenly as they appeared in the historical record, they seemed to disappear. Or did they? For generations, historians have asked the same question. What happened to the Picts? But perhaps that has always been the wrong question. Perhaps the real mystery is not how they disappeared, but how a people so influential could become almost invisible while still helping to shape an entire nation. Today, we are going to follow the evidence left behind in stone, archaeology, ancient chronicles, and modern DNA research to uncover the remarkable story of Scotland's lost people. Along the way, we'll discover why the Romans feared them, why their symbol stones continue to puzzle historians, how one battle changed the future of Britain, and why new scientific discoveries are forcing us to rethink everything we thought we knew about the Picts. If you enjoy uncovering the forgotten stories hidden beneath Britain's history, this is exactly what we do here on UK Bloodlines. Every week, we explore the ancestry, archaeology, surnames, and remarkable civilizations that shaped the British Isles. If that sounds like your kind of journey, consider subscribing, because some of history's greatest mysteries are still waiting to be uncovered. The story begins with a name, and like so much of Pictish history, even that name is more mysterious than it first appears. There is no evidence that the people we call the Picts ever referred to themselves by that title. The word comes from the Latin picti, first recorded by Roman writers during the late 3rd century. It is usually translated as the Painted People, although historians still debate exactly what the Romans meant. Were these northern warriors covered in tattoos? Did they paint themselves before battle? Or was the name simply a convenient label given to several different peoples living beyond Rome's northern frontier? The honest answer is that we do not know. What we do know is that the Romans were not describing a single tribe. Archaeology has completely transformed our understanding of early Scotland, revealing that the Picts were almost certainly a collection of kingdoms spread across northern and eastern Britain. These were not isolated bands of wandering warriors living beyond civilization. They were organized societies with rulers, craftsmen, farmers, religious communities, and thriving centers of power. Kingdoms such as Fortriu, Circin, Fib, Say, and Kate each controlled different regions, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, but gradually developing a shared cultural identity that outsiders came to recognize as Pictish. That realization changes the entire story. For centuries, popular history portrayed the Picts as mysterious barbarians living at the edge of the known world. Modern archaeology paints a very different picture. These were people who built impressive strongholds, controlled valuable farmland, traded across Britain, produced breathtaking works of art, and governed complex societies. Far from existing outside history, they were actively shaping it. Even their origins, once surrounded by speculation, now appear less mysterious than historians once believed. Earlier generations imagined the Picts as invaders arriving from some forgotten homeland or descendants of an entirely separate race. Today, most archaeologists believe something far more fascinating. The Picts were probably the descendants of the Iron Age communities who had lived in northern Scotland for centuries before Rome ever arrived. They did not suddenly appear. They gradually emerged as different communities, formed alliances, shared traditions, and developed a broader political identity. In other words, the Picts were not strangers who arrived in Scotland. They were Scotland's ancient inhabitants, becoming something new, and it was this emerging network of kingdoms that would soon face the greatest military power the ancient world had ever known. The Romans had faced fierce enemies before. They had fought the Gauls in Western Europe, the Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine, and powerful kingdoms throughout the Mediterranean. Each campaign had presented its own challenges, yet Rome possessed something few of its opponents could match: discipline. Roman victories were built on organization. Their legions marched in formation, constructed fortified camps at the end of every day's march, and relied on an astonishing logistical network that kept thousands of soldiers supplied hundreds of miles from home. Northern Scotland was different. The farther the Romans advanced, the less useful many of those advantages became. Roads disappeared into marshland. Narrow valleys broke up military formations. Thick forests limited visibility, while steep hills provided countless places for ambushes. Every river crossing slowed the army. Every mountain pass concealed another unknown danger. A Roman commander could plan the perfect campaign on parchment, but the landscape itself refused to cooperate. To the Picts, however, this was home. They knew where rivers could be crossed safely after heavy rain. They understood which valleys echoed sound and which concealed movement. They recognized the quickest routes across hills that appeared impassable to outsiders. Their greatest weapon was not a particular sword or spear. It was an intimate knowledge of the land itself. This is one reason the story of Hadrian's Wall has often been misunderstood. We tend to think of the wall as a symbol of Roman strength, an immense engineering project that demonstrated the empire's ability to dominate its frontiers. In many ways, it certainly was. Stretching across northern Britain, the wall represented one of Rome's greatest construction achievements, but it also represented something else. It marked the point where expansion became uncertainty. Beyond the frontier lived communities that could be raided, negotiated with, or temporarily subdued, but never fully absorbed into the empire. Rome could march north, win battles, and establish forts, yet holding the territory permanently proved another matter entirely. In the early 2nd century, Emperor Antoninus Pius attempted to push the frontier even farther north by constructing another defensive barrier, now known as the Antonine Wall. For a brief moment, it appeared as though Rome had finally solved the problem. The new frontier stretched across central Scotland, and Roman authority reached farther north than ever before. The success did not last. Maintaining distant garrisons in hostile country demanded enormous resources. Supply lines became increasingly vulnerable. Local resistance never truly disappeared. The cost of occupation steadily outweighed the benefits. Within only a few decades, the Antonine Wall was abandoned, and Roman forces withdrew once again to Hadrian's Wall. That decision speaks volumes. History often celebrates Rome for the lands it conquered. Far less attention is given to the lands it chose not to keep. Northern Britain belonged firmly in that second category. The Romans did not simply encounter fierce warriors. They encountered a society that understood its own landscape so completely that even the greatest military machine of the ancient world struggled to impose lasting control. Yet, despite the respect they eventually developed for these northern kingdoms, Roman writers remained fascinated by one particular detail: their appearance. Ancient descriptions suggest that at least some of the warriors north of the frontier decorated their bodies in ways unfamiliar to Roman eyes. Whether these markings were tattoos, painted designs, ceremonial decoration, or something else entirely, remains one of the most enduring debates in British archaeology. Later generations embraced the dramatic image of blue-painted warriors charging into battle, and popular culture transformed that idea into one of the defining symbols of the Picts. The evidence, however, is less straightforward. No surviving Pictish artwork clearly depicts warriors covered in blue paint, and none of the archaeological discoveries have provided definitive proof that body painting was widespread. The Roman name Picti certainly suggests some form of marking or decoration, but exactly what that meant has been lost to history. Perhaps only elite warriors marked themselves before battle. Perhaps the designs were temporary and used during important ceremonies, or perhaps Roman observers misunderstood what they were seeing. The mystery remains unsolved. Ironically, one of the most famous images associated with the Picts may also be the least certain. But while their appearance continues to spark debate, there is one place where the Picts spoke for themselves, not with words, but with stone. Across Scotland, carved monuments still stand exactly where they were raised more than 1,000 years ago. Others have been carefully preserved in museums after centuries of exposure to wind, rain, and frost. At first glance, they are beautiful works of art. Look more closely, however, and they become something far more intriguing. They are messages from a people whose language has almost entirely disappeared, and although we can still admire every line carved into the stone, we no longer understand everything those lines were trying to say. That mystery would become one of the greatest archaeological puzzles in Britain. Stand before one of these stones today, and it is impossible not to feel a connection with the people who carved them. Every groove was cut by human hands. Every symbol was placed deliberately. Every surface reflects hours, perhaps days, of painstaking craftsmanship. Yet despite all the progress made by archaeologists, historians, and linguists, many of these carvings remain unreadable in the deepest sense of the word. We can see them clearly, but we cannot fully understand the language they were intended to convey. More than 200 Pictish symbol stones have been discovered across Scotland, making them one of the richest collections of early medieval monuments anywhere in Europe. Some stand alone in open fields, where they have overlooked the landscape for centuries. Others are found beside medieval churches, suggesting they remained important long after Christianity spread through Pictish lands. Many have been moved into museums for protection, where they continue to fascinate visitors from around the world. At first, the carvings appear almost decorative, and patterns begin to emerge. A soaring eagle, a powerful bull, a salmon, a boar, a mirror beside a finely carved comb, a crescent crossed by a V-shaped rod, a double disc linked by an elegant Z-shaped line. Then there is perhaps the most mysterious figure of all, the strange creature archaeologists simply call the Pictish beast. Its curved body resembles no living animal with certainty. Some believe it may represent a stylist dolphin. Others suggest a mythical creature known only to the Picts themselves. More cautious scholars simply admit that nobody knows. That uncertainty is precisely what makes these stones so captivating. The repeated appearance of the same symbols across different regions tells us they carried meaning. They were not random decorations carved for beauty alone. Whether they identified powerful families, marked territories, commemorated important events, expressed religious beliefs, or even represented an early symbolic writing system, remains one of the greatest unanswered questions in British archaeology. Imagine discovering an ancient library filled with beautifully illustrated books, only to realize that no one alive can read the language inside them. That is the position historians find themselves in today. The Picts left behind hundreds of messages, but somewhere in the centuries that followed, the key to understanding them disappeared. The stones also reveal something equally important. Whatever else the Picts may have been, they were exceptional artists. Their carvings display confidence, balance, and technical skill that rival the finest stonework produced anywhere in early medieval Europe. Animals appear full of movement. Interwoven patterns flow effortlessly across the surface. Every design suggests a society that valued craftsmanship and symbolism as much as military strength. Then something remarkable happened. As Christianity spread across northern Britain during the 6th and 7th centuries, these ancient artistic traditions did not disappear. Instead, they evolved. New monuments began combining traditional Pictish symbols with towering stone crosses, biblical scenes, and intricate Christian decoration. Rather than replacing the old culture overnight, Christianity blended with it, creating works of art that reflected both ancient traditions and new beliefs. This gradual transformation reminds us that history rarely changes in a single dramatic moment. Civilizations adapt far more often than they collapse. The Picts embraced new religious ideas while preserving elements of their own identity, producing monuments unlike anything else in Britain. Their artistic achievements were only one part of a much larger picture. Archaeological discoveries over the last century have completely overturned the old image of the Picts as scattered tribes living beyond civilization. Excavations at sites such as Burghead, Rhynie, and Forteviot reveal planned settlements, royal centers, impressive fortifications, imported luxury goods, and evidence of sophisticated political organization. Take Burghead, for example. Perched on a headland overlooking the Moray Firth, it was once protected by enormous defensive ramparts stretching across the narrow neck of land leading to the sea. Constructing such a fortress required planning, engineering, leadership, and thousands of hours of labor. Trees had to be felled, stone transported, earth moved, and food supplied to the workers throughout the project. This was not a temporary refuge built during times of danger. It was a permanent center of royal authority. Elsewhere, archaeologists uncovered great timber halls where kings may have received ambassadors, rewarded loyal warriors, and celebrated victories with lavish feasts. Imported glass, finely crafted metalwork, and luxury goods demonstrate that the Picts were connected to trading networks extending far beyond their own borders. They were not isolated from the wider world. They participated in it. Their craftsmen produced magnificent silver brooches, decorated pins, elaborate chains, and beautifully engraved ornaments whose quality continues to astonish specialists today. These objects were more than personal decoration. Like crowns or ceremonial robes in later centuries, they communicated wealth, status, political allegiance, and family identity. In Pictish society, craftsmanship was another expression of power. Yet perhaps the most intriguing aspect of that power was not how it was displayed, but how it was inherited. Among the Picts, the path to becoming king may have been unlike almost anywhere else in early medieval Europe, and that possibility has intrigued historians for more than 1,000 years. For centuries, one sentence shaped almost everything historians believed about Pictish kingship. It came from the Northumbrian scholar Bede, writing in the 8th century, who claimed that when questions arose over succession, the Picts traced the right to rule through the female royal line. It was a remarkable statement, especially when compared with many neighboring kingdoms, where inheritance was usually presented through fathers and sons. Generations of historians interpreted Bede's words in different ways. Some imagined the Picts as a society ruled by queens. Others suggested women selected every future king. Modern scholarship is far more cautious. There is little evidence that ordinary Pictish society was matriarchal, and Bede himself was writing from outside Pictland. Even so, his account may preserve an important truth. Royal women almost certainly carried immense political significance. A marriage could unite rival kingdoms. A mother's ancestry could strengthen a prince's claim to the throne. In a world where bloodlines determined legitimacy, maternal descent may have mattered far more than historians once realized. Whether that system was unique or simply misunderstood, it reminds us that power in the early medieval world rarely followed simple rules. Kings were expected not only to inherit authority, but to defend it. Whether that system was unique or simply misunderstood, it reminds us that power in the early medieval world rarely followed simple rules. Kings were expected not only to inherit authority, but to defend it. They ruled through alliances, loyalty, military success, and personal reputation. A weak ruler could quickly lose everything, while a capable leader could reshape the future of an entire kingdom. No Pictish king demonstrates that better than Brede MacBilly. By the middle of the 7th century, the kingdom of Northumbria had become one of the most powerful states in Britain. Its armies had expanded steadily, bringing neighboring territories under its influence and creating the impression that its rise was unstoppable. Looking north, King Ecgfrith saw the Picts as another obstacle to overcome. Like many ambitious rulers before him, he believed military strength would achieve what diplomacy could not. Brede understood something his opponent did not. He did not need to defeat Northumbria on open ground. He only needed to make the landscape fight alongside him. In 685 AD, the two armies met near a place remembered as Dun Necktine, although historians still debate its exact location. Whatever the precise battlefield, the surrounding terrain favored those who knew it best. Narrow approaches restricted movement. Marshy ground slowed heavily equipped troops. Hills concealed the movements of defending forces. Instead of allowing the Northumbrians to deploy their superior discipline in open formation, the Picts forced them into unfamiliar country, where every advantage gradually disappeared. When the attack finally came, it was devastating. The Northumbrian army collapsed. King Ecgfrith was killed. One of the strongest kingdoms in Britain suffered a defeat from which it never fully recovered. The consequences reached far beyond a single battlefield. Brede's victory secured the independence of the Pictish kingdoms at one of the most critical moments in British history. Had Northumbria succeeded that day, Much of northern Scotland might eventually have fallen under lasting Anglo-Saxon control. The political development of Scotland itself could have followed a very different path. It is one of those rare moments when the outcome of a single battle altered the future of an entire nation. For several generations after Dun Nectaine, the Picts remained among the dominant powers of northern Britain. Their kings ruled from impressive royal centers. Christianity continued spreading across their lands, and their craftsmen produced works of astonishing quality. Looking at the evidence alone, few people living during the 8th century would have predicted that the name Pict would one day disappear from history. Then, from across the sea, came a new challenge, unlike anything they had faced before. The first sign was often a sail appearing on the horizon. Long, narrow ships emerged from the North Sea with astonishing speed. Their crews were skilled sailors, traders, explorers, and warriors. Some arrived seeking wealth through trade, others came to raid. Coastal monasteries, rich in precious metals yet poorly defended, became natural targets. Settlements that had prospered for generations suddenly found themselves exposed to a threat that could strike almost anywhere before vanishing back across the sea. The Vikings changed the political landscape of Scotland, but not in the simple way popular history often suggests. They did not sweep across Pictland in one overwhelming invasion, wiping out an entire people. Their impact was slower, more complicated, and ultimately more profound. Repeated raids disrupted trade, weakened coastal centers, and forced neighboring kingdoms to rethink their alliances. Communities adapted to survive. Rulers looked for new partners. Old rivalries became less important than shared security. At the same time, another transformation was unfolding within Britain itself. To the west, the Gaelic kingdom of Dalriada had long maintained close contact with the Picts through trade, religion, diplomacy, and intermarriage. Over generations, those relationships deepened. Royal families became increasingly connected. Christian institutions linked communities that had once remained separate. Gaelic language and culture gained influence within elite circles, not because one people suddenly replaced another, but because neighboring societies gradually became intertwined. History often encourages us to think in terms of dramatic endings. Empires collapse, kingdoms disappear, civilizations are conquered. Yet the evidence from early medieval Scotland tells a different story. The greatest transformation in Pictish history did not happen overnight. It happened so gradually that the people living through it may never have realized how profoundly their world was changing. Generations later, storytellers would look back at this period and search for a single dramatic moment when the Picts disappeared. They imagined one decisive conquest, one final battle, one ruthless king who swept away an entire civilization. It made for compelling history. The truth appears far more remarkable. As Viking pressure continued along Scotland's coasts, political realities forced neighboring kingdoms closer together. Leaders who had once competed for territory now faced a common threat. Royal families became increasingly connected through marriage. Christian churches linked communities across former political boundaries. Trade, diplomacy, and shared defense gradually created a new balance of power. It is within this changing world that one of Scotland's most famous figures emerges, Kenneth MacAlpin. Few rulers have attracted as much legend as Kenneth. According to a story repeated for centuries, he invited the leading Pictish nobles to a grand feast. Food was plentiful, wine flowed freely, and friendship appeared to unite everyone gathered in the hall. Then, according to the tale, hidden assassins struck, murdering the Pictish leaders in a single act of betrayal remembered as MacAlpin's treason. It is an unforgettable story. It is also almost certainly not true. Modern historians find little contemporary evidence to support the legend. The earliest detailed versions appear centuries after the events they claim to describe, making them far more likely to reflect political storytelling than reliable history. Medieval chroniclers often created dramatic origin stories to explain complicated political changes, and Kenneth's supposed massacre fits that tradition remarkably well. The historical reality was almost certainly less dramatic, but far more convincing. Rather than destroying the Picts, Kenneth inherited a world in which Pictish and Gaelic elites had already been interacting for generations. By the middle of the 9th century, the distinctions between the two cultures had become increasingly blurred. Kings ruled mixed populations. Noble families shared ancestry. Religious institutions served communities across old political boundaries. What emerged was not the replacement of one people by another, but the gradual formation of a new kingdom. That kingdom became known as Alba, From Alba would eventually grow the medieval kingdom of Scotland. This is one of the most important turning points in British history because it changes the question entirely. Historians once asked how the Scots conquered the Picts. Increasingly, archaeologists and medieval specialists are asking something different. What if they never did? What if the kingdom of Alba was built not through conquest, but through the merging of peoples who had already been sharing the same landscape for generations? The more evidence we uncover, the stronger that possibility becomes. For centuries, historians relied almost entirely on written sources to answer questions like these. The problem was that the Picts left very little writing of their own. Their story had to be reconstructed through the observations of outsiders, many of whom misunderstood the people they described or wrote with political agendas of their own. Today, however, historians have gained a powerful new source of evidence: ancient DNA. Advances in genetic research have transformed archaeology over the last 2 decades. Scientists can now recover DNA from human remains buried more than 1,000 years ago, allowing them to compare ancient populations with one another in ways that previous generations could never imagine. When researchers began studying remains from areas associated with the Picts, the results challenged one of the oldest assumptions in Scottish history. There was no evidence that the Picts were a mysterious foreign people who suddenly appeared in northern Britain. Instead, the genetic evidence points toward continuity. The people living in Pictish territories appear closely related to earlier populations that had occupied the same regions long before Roman writers first recorded the name Picti. In other words, the Picts were not outsiders arriving from some forgotten homeland. They were the descendants of communities whose ancestors had lived in Scotland for centuries. Perhaps even more revealing is what happened after the Pictish kingdoms disappeared from the written record. Researchers have found no evidence for a large-scale population replacement that would explain the disappearance of the Picts as a people. There is no sign that an entirely new population swept into eastern Scotland and displaced those already living there. Instead, the genetic continuity remains remarkably strong. That discovery changes everything. The Picts did not vanish biologically. They vanished politically. Their language gradually faded. Their rulers adopted new identities. Their kingdoms became part of Alba. Their descendants began calling themselves something different. But the people themselves remained. History had not erased them. History had simply changed the name by which they were remembered. And perhaps that is the greatest twist in this entire story. For more than 1,000 years, we have searched for the disappearance of a people who may never have disappeared at all. Perhaps that is why the Picts continue to capture our imagination more than any other early people in Britain. The mystery was never really about painted warriors or forgotten kings. It was about identity. How does an entire civilization help create a nation yet slowly disappear from its own story? The answer lies all around us, hidden not in dusty manuscripts, but in Scotland itself. Travel across eastern Scotland today, and echoes of the Picts still survive in ways most people never notice. Place names beginning with Pit, derived from the old Pictish word pet, meaning a portion of land or estate, remain scattered across the landscape. Towns such as Pitlochry, Pittenweem, and Pitmedden quietly preserve fragments of a language that has not been spoken for more than 1,000 years. Most visitors drive through these places without giving their names a second thought, unaware that they are repeating words first spoken during the age of the Pictish kings. The same is true of Scotland's artistic heritage. The intricate knotwork admired on medieval crosses, illuminated manuscripts, and later Scottish carvings did not appear from nowhere. Many of those traditions grew from artistic styles that Pictish craftsmen had already mastered centuries earlier. Their influence can still be seen in museums, churches, castles, and archaeological sites across the country. Even after their political identity disappeared, their artistic legacy continued inspiring generations that no longer called themselves Picts. Archaeology continues adding new chapters to their story almost every year. At Rhynie, excavations uncovered evidence of an elite settlement unlike anything historians had expected. Massive timber halls, imported Mediterranean pottery, a high-status metalwork, and ceremonial objects revealed a center of royal power that transformed our understanding of Pictish society. These discoveries showed that the rulers of northern Scotland were participating in diplomatic and trading networks stretching far beyond their own borders. At Burghead, one of the largest early medieval forts in Britain, continues to reveal new secrets beneath its earthworks. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of monumental defenses, sophisticated planning, and ritual activity that speaks of a kingdom organized on a remarkable scale. Nearby discoveries of carved bulls, unique to Burghead, hint at symbols of authority whose meanings have long since been forgotten. Then there is the magnificent Hilton of Cadboll stone, one of the finest surviving masterpieces of Pictish art. Its beautifully carved horsemen, hunting scenes, intricate patterns, and towering cross demonstrate extraordinary artistic confidence. Every visitor who stands before it is confronted with the same thought. How could a people capable of creating something so sophisticated remain misunderstood for so long? Perhaps because they left so few written words behind. History often favors those who record their own achievements. Rome filled libraries with its victories. Medieval kings commissioned chronicles celebrating their reigns. Empires preserved their stories in documents, inscriptions, and official records. The Picts chose a different language: stone, metal, landscape, memory. Their history survives not because they wrote it down, but because they carved it into the world around them. Ironically, that may be why modern archaeology has become so important. Every excavation allows the Picts to speak again. Every newly discovered settlement, cemetery, workshop, or carved stone adds another sentence to a story that has remained unfinished for more than a millennium. Unlike many ancient civilizations whose histories are largely complete, the Picts continue to surprise us. The next discovery could fundamentally change what we think we know about their kings, their language, their religion, or even the meaning of the mysterious symbols that still puzzle experts today. That possibility makes their story feel uniquely alive. Most ancient civilizations are remembered through certainty. The Picts are remembered through questions, and perhaps that is exactly why they continue to fascinate us. They remind us that history is never truly finished. It evolves with every archaeological excavation, every scientific breakthrough, and every new generation willing to challenge old assumptions. What seemed certain a century ago has already been rewritten. What we believe today may change again tomorrow, so perhaps we have spent centuries asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, what happened to the Picts? Perhaps we should ask how much of the Picts still survives, because the evidence points toward a remarkable answer. They survived in the people who continued farming the same valleys after the kingdom of Alba emerged. They survived in families whose bloodlines stretched back through countless generations. They survived in place names spoken every day across Scotland. They survived in artistic traditions passed from one craftsman to another. They survived in ancient stones that still stand against the Scottish sky, silently refusing to surrender all their secrets. The Picts did not become a forgotten civilization swallowed by history. They became part of Scotland, long before castles crowned the hills, long before tartan became a symbol recognized around the world, long before the Highland clans entered legend. There were the Picts. They defended their homeland against Rome, built kingdoms that rivaled their neighbors, created some of the finest art in early medieval Europe, and laid foundations upon which the Kingdom of Scotland would eventually rise. Their greatest achievement was not surviving Rome, it was surviving history itself, not as a separate nation, not as a forgotten race, but as ancestors whose legacy still lives beneath Scotland's landscapes, within its archaeology, and perhaps even within the family trees of millions of people today. The next time you stand before a weathered Pictish stone, pause for a moment. Look beyond the carvings. Imagine the hands that shaped them, the community that gathered around them, and the generations that passed beneath their shadow. Those stones are not simply relics from a vanished age. They are voices reaching across more than 1,000 years, reminding us that history is rarely about people who disappear. More often, it is about people who change, adapt, and quietly become the foundation of everything that follows. If this journey into Scotland's forgotten past has changed the way you see its history, we'd love to have you join us here on UK Bloodlines. Every week, we uncover the hidden stories behind Britain's ancient peoples, remarkable surnames, forgotten kingdoms, DNA discoveries, and the bloodlines that continue connecting the modern world with its distant past. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and become part of a growing community that believes history is never truly lost, only waiting to be rediscovered. And before you leave, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think the Picts disappeared, or do you believe they simply became the Scots? Share your opinion in the comments below. Some of the best conversations begin with questions history has not fully answered. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and remember that the past is never as distant as it seems. Sometimes it is hidden in the names we speak, the places we visit, and the stories that have been waiting centuries to be told.